So I'm going to call on Jay, started off as talking about those subjects and the other issues that he wants to raise.
Now I have to earn that applause. It's great to be in Oconomowoc, a town that, when I first moved to Wisconsin in 1988 from Washington, D.C., was the most intimidating on paper to figure out how to say. And even now, I don't have any trouble, but it's always fun to put the word Oconomowoc in front of other people. Because back then, there were a lot of moderate Republicans. They were Republicans, even liberal Republicans. We considered ourselves, as I was growing up, to be Rockefeller Republicans. I don't know if that means a lot, but it would be here in Wisconsin akin to being a Warren Knowles Republican or a Lee Sherman Gravis Republican. They were moderates who were partisan, but at the end of the day always wanted to do what was best for Wisconsin and always were willing to seek areas of compromise and come together with Democrats for the good of the people of the state, not for their own partisan self-interest. And as Fred absolutely is so correct about, what's happening now is that you have a Republican Party in this state that has not only embarked on a whole agenda that is far to the right than anything that even Barry Goldwater would have envisioned in 1964, but it is a party that's ruthless, has no desire at all to seek compromise with the other side, does everything in secret behind closed doors, really violates every tenet of good government in Wisconsin. One of the reasons I moved here, by the way, in 1988 was because this state had a national reputation as being the model for state government in the nation. It was open, it was accountable, it was clean, money was not the deciding factor in elections, and it was a state that, although evenly divided and elected such extremes as Senator Joseph McCarthy on the right, but also Warren Knowles, less conservative, but Gaylord Nelson, and of course Robert LaFollette, or my favorite governor, probably someone you've never heard of, a guy named Francis McGovern, who in 1910 actually implemented all of the proposed LaFollette reforms. He was a real doer, McGovern was, and he was a progressive Republican, and then ended his career in 1940 running for the U.S. Senate as a Democrat. So he kind of made the same progression all over politics as I have. But what we're seeing today, and what's going to happen actually beginning next week, is that legislation will be introduced to destroy the Wisconsin Government Accountability Board, which, by the way, is the only entity in the nation that oversees elections, campaign finance, lobbying, and what did I miss? Campaign finance, and ethics, campaign finance, and lobbying in the nation that is not partisan controlled. It's a nonpartisan entity. It was created only very recently in 2007, and it was created as a result of a bipartisan scandal. You will recall, and Oconomowoc's own Steve Foti, who was then the Republican Majority Leader, along with Scott Jensen and Bonnie Ladwick, who was the Assistant Majority Leader, and then the Senate Majority Leader, the Democrat Chuck Chvala, and Brian Burke, the powerful chair of the Joint Finance Committee, were all criminally charged with felony misconduct in public office. It was a bipartisan scandal, and it demanded a bipartisan solution to that scandal. And the one thing that was necessary on the eyes of both Republicans and Democrats at that time was that there needed to be a replacement for the State Elections Board and the State Ethics Boards, because both of those entities, particularly the State Elections Board, was a partisan entity where the appointments to the State Elections Board were from the Senate Majority Leader, the Senate Minority Leader, the Assembly Speaker, the Assembly Minority Leader, the Governor, the two heads of the political parties, and the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And what you had was an entity that oversaw our elections and campaign finance laws that wasn't based on the law, it was in fact based on partisan preference. And they utterly failed to investigate or even acknowledge the corruption that was occurring in Wisconsin in the late 1990s. By the way, not when Fred Kessler was in office. Fred, as you know, was in the 60s and after that time. Interesting that was the case. But at that time, both political Qualla and Jensen were engaged in behavior that was clearly in violation of state statute and clearly in violation of the public trust in Wisconsin. And so in 2002, on simultaneous days in October, just 13 years ago, we had something that no other state in the country ever experienced. And that was the simultaneous criminal charging of both the top leadership in the Democratic Party in the legislature and the top leadership in the Republican Party in the state assembly on simultaneous days. This wasn't Illinois that this happened in, it wasn't New Jersey, it wasn't Pennsylvania, New York, states that I have lived in and where you would expect to see a great deal more of the kind of political corruption than ever you would have thought to have seen here in Wisconsin. But it happened here. And so from that time, I began meeting with a now departed Republican state senator who you may have heard of, a guy by the name of Michael Ellis of Neenah. And Ellis and I and others started talking about the need to replace the State Elections Board and the State Ethics Board with something that was independent, something that was nonpartisan, something that wasn't going to allow the kind of conduct to have occurred in the Capitol that the state elections and state ethics boards did, and understandably, because their appropriations were controlled by the legislative leadership. It was unlikely that Qualla and Jensen were going to authorize monies to be investigated by the entities whose job it was to do so, if in fact they were going to be the subject of the investigation. So the reason we have a nonpartisan entity, the Government Accountability Board, is because it was a bipartisan scandal. And that's the reason. And I hear Republicans now saying, well, the GAB isn't in place in any other state in the country. Well, there's a lot of states that are looking at it and would love to have it. But the fact is that we had a unique circumstance in 2002, a bipartisan scandal that created the GAB. And it has worked well by almost any measure. It has angered the Democrats when they were in power. In 2009, Senate Majority Leader Russ Decker, the Democrat from Wausau, tried to end the stream of funding that funds investigations for corruption in a budget amendment. We called him out on it. We got every newspaper in the state to rally against it. We got hundreds of citizens to call, and he backed off because he heard the wrath of the people. Now you have something even far worse. The Republicans who are in charge want to get rid of the GAB, and they want to get rid of it mainly for two reasons. Number one, they don't like that it's independent. First and foremost, they, as you know, are systematically trying to gain control of every entity in state government, and if they don't like what an entity does, they try to get rid of it. The Legislative Audit Bureau, the Open Records Law. You can go right down the list. They're trying to put more political appointments in government agencies and have more people that will be accountable to their political demands rather than to the trust of the people. And so it is with the GAB. And of course, the one reason they really want to go after the GAB is because the Government Accountability Board, which by the way, as you know, consists of 6 retired judges. By the way, the 6 retired judges who now sit on the GAB have all now either been appointed or reappointed by the current governor, Scott Walker. So this idea that the Republicans have charged that the GAB is a partisan liberal organization, the idea that these 6 judges depend on the advice of the staff and don't make decisions on their own, those are all lies. They're garbage, but they're put out there for you so that you and the people of Wisconsin will think that the GAB is doing something wrong and needs to be reformed. Oh, it needs to be tweaked. There's a few entities, any entity in state government needs to be tweaked from time to time. But, and by the way, there is a handout back there which lists the falsehoods about the GAB as well as the reasons to keep it, which I would encourage you to take a look at. So the Government Accountability Board, in the way the Republicans want to set it up, and this is going to begin next week, is that they would like to replace the judges, get rid of them. And these judges, by the way, 3 of them at one time had Republican credentials. Tom Barland was a Republican state representative from Eau Claire. I think back when Fred was there in the 60s. There was another Republican judge, David Deininger, who was actually kicked off the board by Walker, not reappointed, because he was too impartial and too objective. And apparently Scott Walker didn't like the types of decisions he was making. But the real reason is they want to have partisan control. And the real reason they want to have partisan control is they're angry that the Government Accountability Board rightfully did what they were supposed to do. They authorized an investigation into possible illegal campaign coordination between Governor Walker's recall campaign in 2012 with outside groups, primarily Wisconsin Club for Growth and Wisconsin Manufacturers and Commerce. And those entities under Wisconsin law are not allowed to collude with the campaigns of a candidate. That has been on the books for decades. And so the GAB unanimously and very correctly authorized, and by the way, not a partisan investigation into the illegal coordination. It was undertaken by a Republican special prosecutor, Francis Schmidt, who, by the way, voted for Walker in 2010, 2 Republican district attorneys and 3 Democratic district attorneys, including John Chisholm, the district attorney of Milwaukee County. And the Republicans focused on Chisholm only, made up considerable lies about why Chisholm got involved in this and what his motivation was, which was completely unfounded and completely untrue. And the GAB unanimously voted to authorize that investigation. Now that investigation, as you may know, ended this summer when the Wisconsin Supreme Court, in a very divided opinion, 4-3, voted to end the John Doe investigation. And it was a decision that ought to outrage all of you, because the 4 justices that voted for it were highly compromised by one of the parties in the case, Wisconsin Club for Growth, who contributed $8.5 million to get those 4 conservatives elected to the court. They should have recused themselves. It never should have been heard by the Wisconsin Supreme Court. And if you read their opinion, it's not based on law. It's based on reiterating quotes from the Wall Street Journal editorial page. Has nothing to do with the law at all. So that was a disgrace. And by the way, the decision will be appealed, and we think on the basis of the law, there's a very good chance that it'll be overturned, and that the John Doe investigation could very well be reestablished. That takes time, however. The Republicans are not waiting for that. They want to get rid of the Government Accountability Board now. That's their priority in this legislative session, not economic development, not anything to do with school financing, not anything to do with taxes, not anything to do with the environment, not anything to do with the needs of the people of Wisconsin, but it's part of their Me Too selfish agenda to gain more and more control over what's happening. But what I will do, what I want to finish up